The medieval night was not like the night we know today. Imagine the moment the sun dipped below the horizon, leaving behind the last streaks of crimson and gold in the sky. One by one, the candles were lit, fires were coaxed into glowing embers, and the world slipped into a hushed rhythm. The hum of daytime activity gave way to the creak of wooden beams, the low murmur of voices, and the occasional distant bark of a dog. The medieval household prepared for sleep, but if you were to step quietly inside a chamber or cottage, you would notice something strange. The people were not lying flat, as we do, stretched across their mattresses. Instead, they sat half upright, their bodies propped against pillows, bolsters, or the carved headboards of their beds. It was as if they had chosen to rest in a posture between waking and dreaming, never surrendering fully to the pull of sleep. This simple detail, that many medieval people preferred to sleep sitting up rather than lying down, seems at first glance almost unbelievable to the modern mind. After all, the flat bed is one of the most familiar and comforting images of human life. To us, lying down signals complete rest. It is the posture of release, of comfort, of stillness. Yet for centuries, generations of men and women across Europe chose instead to sleep in a way that appears awkward and unnatural to us. Why would they do this? What could possibly make this posture more desirable than the ease of lying flat? To answer that question, we must journey not just into history, but into the texture of medieval life itself, into its beliefs, its fears, its medicine, its rhythms of night and day. The truth is not a single reason, but a tapestry of explanations, a blend of practical necessity, health concerns, religious symbolism, cultural tradition, and even superstition. Each thread of this tapestry helps us see that what we consider normal sleep is, in fact, far from timeless. It is a recent invention, a product of modernity, while in the centuries before, people inhabited the night very differently. Picture a chamber within a medieval manor. The firelight flickers on painted walls and carved beams, casting long shadows across the room. A great bed stands against one side, its posts rising like pillars, its canopy heavy with embroidered cloth. On the mattress lie cushions and bolsters arranged not for sprawling, but for leaning. A noble couple sits together, backs resting against the raised support, their bodies angled halfway between upright and reclined. They talk quietly before drifting off, their posture as natural to them as lying flat is to us. Now imagine a humbler dwelling. A peasant family huddles on a straw-filled mattress or a bench against the wall. Children doze upright beside their parents, heads nodding onto shoulders, their legs tucked close to preserve warmth. The fire in the hearth glows dim, filling the air with the scent of smoke and wood. Here too, sleep is not the flat, isolated ritual of the modern world, but a shared and watchful state, half turned toward wakefulness. The image raises a deep curiosity. We might be tempted to dismiss upright sleeping as a quirk of furniture or custom, but in truth it reflected the entire worldview of medieval people. To them, night was not a time of complete safety, nor was sleep an unquestioned refuge. It was a dangerous passage, a threshold between the known world of waking life and the mysterious world of spirits, dreams, and even death. Lying flat, so still, so like a corpse, carried with it an uncomfortable closeness to death itself. Upright sleep, by contrast, kept the body alert, alive, positioned as if ready to wake at a moment's notice. This first glimpse into their sleeping posture opens a door for us into a world at once familiar and alien. We too seek rest, peace and dreams in the night. But the way medieval people prepared for sleep, the way they arranged their bodies, and the meanings they attached to those choices, all of it reveals how profoundly different their relationship with the night was. To them, the simple act of lying down flat was never merely physical. It was spiritual, medical, even symbolic. To them, sitting up made sense in ways that our modern habits cannot easily imagine. And so, the mystery unfolds. Why did medieval people sleep sitting up? The answer will carry us through their homes and streets, into monasteries and castles, across beds of straw and cushions of velvet. It will take us into the pages of medieval medical texts, into the whispered fears of demons in the dark, into the rhythms of first sleep and second sleep that divided the night. Along the way, we will see that upright sleep was not merely a matter of comfort, but an expression of how people in the Middle Ages understood the world. But before we move deeper, pause here in the doorway of that chamber. Look again at the dim light of the medieval night. Watch the nobleman adjusting his pillows, the servant curling against a bench, the family huddled upright against one another. Listen to the fire crackle, the night wind rattle against shutters, the distant hoot of an owl. This is the world we are entering, a world where sitting up to sleep was not strange but normal, a world where posture itself was shaped by fears, by faith, and by the fragile balance between life and death. The medieval world entered night in a way very different from ours. Today, darkness is something we push back effortlessly with the flip of a switch. Our homes remain bright, our streets glowing with lamps, our devices keeping us alert long after the sun has set. But in the Middle Ages, night was an event of its own. It came slowly but surely, stretching across the landscape like a vast cloak, and once it descended, it ruled completely. The world after sunset belonged not to humans but to shadows, silence, and mystery. For the medieval mind, night was not merely a time of absence, the absence of light, the absence of work, the absence of activity. It was a presence in itself, alive with meanings and dangers. When the sun slipped below the horizon, life shifted into another rhythm, a rhythm governed by firelight, candlelight, and imagination. Darkness was heavy and all-encompassing, pierced only by the dim glow of hearths and torches. Even the moon, when visible, could cast a pale and ghostly light that only deepened the sense of otherworldliness. Step into a medieval village as dusk gathers, the air cools, carrying the scent of damp earth and smoke. Farmers and laborers finish their work in haste, for without the sun there is little they can do. Animals are herded into barns, tools laid aside, and doors barred. In cottages, meals are eaten quickly, often simple fare, bread, pottage, cheese. The fire is tended carefully, for it must last through the night. As the last scraps are cleared away, the villagers sit in near darkness, the flicker of flame their only company. Night has claimed the world outside, and few dare venture into it. Why such caution? Because the night for medieval people was never safe. Streets were unlit and treacherous. Thieves and vagabonds took shelter in the darkness, their movements unseen. Wild animals prowled the edges of fields and forests. But beyond physical danger lay something deeper, the belief that night opened a door between this world and the unseen. Spirits, demons and witches were thought to wander freely once darkness fell. To step outside was to risk an encounter with forces far beyond human control. Yet for all its dangers, the night was not without beauty. Monks who rose for prayer described the stars as vast, glittering lanterns of heaven, a vision that filled the soul with awe. Pilgrims sometimes traveled under the cover of moonlight, finding in the quiet an almost sacred stillness. And within homes, the night was also a time of intimacy. Families gathered close around the hearth, telling stories, singing or whispering prayers. The medieval night was both comforting and terrifying, both peaceful and filled with dread, a duality that shaped how people approach sleep. This duality also explains why sleeping upright seemed so natural. Night was not the time for complete surrender. To lie flat, utterly vulnerable in the darkness of a medieval night, was a dangerous prospect. Sleep was necessary, but it was also risky. By sitting or reclining upright, people felt that they kept one foot, so to speak, in the waking world. They could rise more quickly if danger approached, whether from thieves, fire, or supernatural forces. They could watch and listen even as they rested, their posture reminding them that vigilance was never entirely abandoned. Consider too how the rhythm of night was divided. For medieval people, time was not counted by clocks but by natural markers, the call of a rooster, the toll of a church bell, the shifting of the stars. At night bells might ring for compline or matins, the canonical hours of prayer observed in monasteries. These sacred rhythms broke the night into segments, shaping how people understood the passage of time. Between these hours, silence reigned, broken only by the creak of timbers or the sigh of wind through shutters. In castles, the rhythm of darkness carried a different tone. Guards patrolled the walls, their torches glowing faintly against the stone. The great hall grew quiet, its laughter and feasting replaced by the low hum of embers dying in the hearth. Servants tucked themselves onto benches or pallets, while lords and ladies withdrew to chambers lit by a single candle. Outside the thick walls, however, night stretched endlessly, a reminder of vulnerability even to the powerful. The upright sleeping posture, bolstered by cushions or wooden supports, was a silent acknowledgement that the night was never entirely conquered. In monasteries, the rhythm of darkness was deeply spiritual. Monks retired to their narrow cells, where sleep was taken lightly, almost reluctantly. To them, night was not merely a time to rest, but an opportunity for prayer, reflection, and watchfulness. Sleep was a concession, not a pleasure. Upright resting allowed them to drift into slumber without abandoning the readiness to rise when the bell called them to prayer. In this way, posture became not just physical but devotional, a gesture of vigilance before God. The fear of the night mingled with its sacredness, created an atmosphere in which upright sleep seemed fitting. It was a posture of compromise between surrender and alertness, between the human need for rest and the medieval conviction that one must remain watchful. Night was alive with possibility, but it was also alive with threat. Upright sleeping reflected that truth. But perhaps the most striking difference between their nights and ours was the silence. Today, even at midnight, we hear the hum of machines, the glow of distant traffic, the artificial buzz of modern life. In the medieval world, silence was absolute. The night pressed in on every side, thick and unbroken. Within such silence, every creak of wood, every howl of wind, every bark of a dog took on heightened significance. Upright sleeping allowed people to remain partly in tune with these sounds, listening for what might signal safety or danger. To us, night is simply the other half of the day, softened by electric light and extended by technology. To the medieval person, it was a world unto itself, mysterious, threatening, sacred, and alive. In that world, how one slept mattered profoundly. It was not only about comfort, but about survival, faith, and the constant balance between life and death. Upright sleeping made sense because the night was never fully trusted. As we move deeper into this journey, keep this rhythm of darkness in mind. The medieval night was not passive, it was active, breathing, filled with presence. To step into it was to step into another reality altogether. And it is within this reality, where shadows and spirits seem to whisper in the dark, where silence was heavy and watchfulness essential, that we begin to understand why sleep itself was shaped differently, why posture was more than posture, and why the people of that age drifted into dreams not lying flat, but sitting half upright, half ready, and wholly bound to the mysteries of the night. In our modern world, we imagine sleep as one long stretch, 7 or 8 hours spent drifting from light slumber into deep rest and back again. We lie down, close our eyes, and expect to wake with the sun. But in the Middle Ages, the rhythm of night followed a very different pattern, one that seems almost alien to us now, though it was natural to them. People of the medieval world did not always sleep in a single block. Instead, their night was often divided into two distinct halves, a first sleep and a second sleep, separated by a mysterious and important waking period. Imagine a medieval household settling for the night. The fire has been banked, the doors barred. The family, sitting upright or reclining against cushions, closes their eyes and drifts into what they called the first sleep. This first period often lasted 3 to 4 hours, a deep rest that came quickly after a day of hard labor. But unlike us, they did not expect to remain asleep until morning. At some point in the middle of the night, the household stirred. People awoke naturally, almost as if their bodies were tuned to this rhythm. For an hour or two, they lingered in a half-lit space between wakefulness and slumber, a sacred interval, the French once called dorveil, a waking sleep. During this waking time, people did not rush to start their day. Instead, they embraced it as a natural part of the night. Some prayed quietly, believing these hours were especially blessed, a time when God listened more closely, Monks too rose for midnight prayers, their chants echoing in stone chapels, under the watch of flickering candles. For ordinary villagers, the waking interval might be filled with softer, more private moments. Parents whispered together, couples shared intimacy, neighbors visited one another, or solitary souls sat by the embers of the fire, staring into its glow, while thoughts wandered like dreams, still half clinging to the mind. The records of this practice survive in letters, diaries, and even court documents. People spoke casually of their first sleep, as if it were common knowledge. A person might say they awoke after their first sleep to mend a tool, or to fetch more wood, or to reflect on a troubling dream. Physicians of the time even referred to first sleep and second sleep when prescribing remedies, believing that the body's humors and digestion followed this nightly rhythm. This two-part pattern shaped the way people understood rest itself. First sleep was restorative, deep and heavy, necessary for the body. The waking interval was contemplative, a time for the mind or spirit. Second sleep, lighter and often filled with dreams, carried the household into dawn. In this structure, sleep was not an interruption of life, but an extension of it, divided naturally into parts that allowed for both rest and reflection. The upright posture of medieval sleepers made this pattern easier. Sitting or reclining upright meant one could rise easily when the first sleep ended, without the stiffness or disorientation we often feel when pulled from deep slumber. People could stand, move, tend the fire, or kneel in prayer, then return to their beds and slip into the softer embrace of second sleep. In this way, posture and rhythm worked hand in hand, creating a night unlike ours, a night alive with pauses, transitions, and layers of meaning. Consider for a moment the difference this makes. To us, waking in the middle of the night often feels like a disruption, even a problem. We count the hours of rest lost, fret about exhaustion the next day, and struggle anxiously to fall back asleep. To the medieval sleeper, however, waking in the night was no cause for alarm. It was expected, even welcomed. The quiet interval was a gift, a time outside the rush of daylight obligations, a pause where one could breathe, think and dream with open eyes. Literary references confirm this rhythm. In Chaucer's tales, in monastic records, in farmers' journals, the language of first sleep and second sleep appears without explanation, because no explanation was needed. Everyone understood. It was simply the way of the night. In court cases, witnesses might describe crimes that occurred after the first sleep, marking the time of night, as clearly as we might say, at midnight. This division was not just biological but cultural, a shared understanding that shaped social life. During the waking interval, many believed that dreams from the first sleep could be interpreted or acted upon. Dream books circulated, offering guides to the symbols one might encounter between sleeps. A dream of water, of animals, of journeys, all held meaning, all seemed more vivid in that midnight pause. Upright posture aided this too, for sitting up or reclining half awake gave space for reflection before the second descent into dreams. The waking hours could also be practical. In villages, people tended livestock, checked on their children, or even went out with lanterns to visit a neighbor in need. In homes, couples often found this interval ideal for intimacy. Historians have noted that medical texts even recommended the waking period for conception, believing that the body, refreshed by first sleep, was then more fertile and ready. In this way, the rhythm of night shaped not only private life, but family and community. Religious devotion gave the hours special weight. Monks were not the only ones who prayed in the middle of the night. Ordinary people too believed that their prayers between sleeps were more powerful. The silence of the world, the depth of darkness, and the stillness of the household, all combined to make the interval feel sacred. Many believed that God listened most attentively then, as if the veil between heaven and earth was thinner. Upright posture again supported this devotion, allowing one to kneel, sit, or bow in reverence during the waking pause. When dawn approached, the second sleep carried people gently into the day. This sleep was lighter, filled with dreams often remembered. It was closer to waking, to the call of roosters, to the glow of morning light. Unlike the heavy first sleep, the second was more ethereal, a bridge into daylight, rather than a plunge into unconsciousness. Dreams of this period were often seen as more prophetic, more charged with meaning, and people carried them into their day with curiosity. What strikes us, looking back, is how natural this broken rhythm seems in its own time. Without artificial light, the body often follows shorter cycles of rest and wakefulness. Modern experiments have shown that when people live without electricity, they often fall into a two-part sleep, remarkably similar to that of the Middle Ages. In this way, medieval sleepers were not odd at all. They were following the rhythm of human biology, unshaped by the artificial extensions of light that now bind us to one long block of rest. First sleep and second sleep remind us that night is not a single silent stretch, but a landscape with its own valleys and peaks, its own quiet hours and stirrings. For the medieval person, upright posture was perfectly suited to this world of segmented rest. It allowed the body to move easily between phases, to wake without alarm, to reflect and pray before slipping back into dreams. Their night was not broken but whole, a tapestry woven of two sleeps, and a sacred pause between. As we leave this section, hold in your mind the image of a medieval family, waking gently after their first sleep. The fire glows faintly, the air is cool, silence lies heavy around them. A father rises to stir the coals, a mother whispers to her child, a monk far away chants in a chapel, his voice echoing under vaulted stone. Then after an hour or two, all drift back into their beds, upright once more, and surrender to the second sleep. It is a rhythm forgotten by us, but deeply human, deeply bound to the mysteries of the night. When we picture a bed today, we imagine a private sanctuary, a soft mattress, clean sheets, perhaps a partner beside us, but rarely anyone else. Sleep to us is an intimate and solitary act, set apart from the bustle of daily life. But in the Middle Ages, the bed was anything but private. It was a shared communal space, a place where family, servants, and sometimes even strangers lay side by side. To understand why upright sleeping made sense, we must first understand this world of shared rest. Step into a peasant's cottage. The space is small, perhaps a single room of wattle and daub, its walls smeared with clay and straw. The floor is earthen, scattered with rushes to absorb dirt and moisture. At one end, a hearth glows faintly, its smoke drifting upward through a hole in the roof. Along the wall, a low wooden frame, or even a pile of straw, serves as the family's bed. Onto this they spread blankets, furs or rough cloths. Children, parents, even grandparents huddle together in a jumble of limbs. In the cold months, dogs or livestock might be brought inside, their warmth welcomed. Privacy was a luxury no one expected. In such close quarters, sleeping upright or propped against the wall had obvious benefits. It created a little space in the crowd, a posture that allowed one to doze without being smothered. It also made rising easier, whether to tend the fire, quiet a child, or relieve oneself outside. Sleep here was not a sealed retreat, but part of the flow of family life, noisy and interrupted, shared and practical. Now shift the scene to a medieval inn, a place where travelers stopped along busy roads or market towns. Beds were scarce, rooms crowded, guests were expected to share whatever space was available. It was not unusual for strangers to sleep together, pressed shoulder to shoulder, sometimes 3 or 4 to a bed. A weary pilgrim might find himself beside a merchant, a farmer, or even a thief. Upright sleeping allowed one to maintain a posture of caution, to doze without surrendering completely to vulnerability in such company. The communal bed was not a place of luxury, but of necessity, and posture became a quiet way of staying guarded. For those of higher status, the bed was both more elaborate and more symbolic. In castles and manors, great beds stood as the centerpiece of chambers. Heavy frames of oak or walnut were carved with patterns of vines and saints. Rich hangings enclosed the bed not merely for decoration, but for warmth and privacy in drafty stone halls. Feather mattresses, layered with linen sheets and woolen blankets, created a softness unknown to peasants. Yet even in such splendor, beds were rarely solitary. Servants often slept nearby, sometimes on pallets at the foot of the lord's bed, sometimes within the same space entirely. A chamber was never truly private, and upright sleeping allowed conversation, prayer, or sudden rising without the awkwardness of untangling from deep horizontal rest. In monasteries, the arrangement was different again. Monks slept in dormitories, rows of narrow beds or wooden stools lined along the walls. Silence was expected, and the posture of rest was modest, disciplined, almost ascetic. Upright reclining suited this environment, reminding the monk that sleep was not indulgence, but necessity. The communal dormitory, filled with the quiet rustle of robes and the sound of breathing, was a place where individuality vanished and posture reflected obedience to a spiritual rhythm. Furniture tells its own story. Medieval beds, even among the wealthy, were often designed for reclining rather than sprawling flat. High pillows, bolsters, and angled headboards encouraged a semi-upright position. Benches and chests often doubled as sleeping places, their hard surfaces softened only by cloths or straw. In such cases, sitting up or leaning against the wall was the natural way to rest. The modern idea of a perfectly horizontal mattress, tailored for deep and solitary sleep, simply did not exist. The practice of shared sleep created a different relationship with the night. It was noisy, the sound of snoring, coughing, shifting, the crackle of the hearth, the scratching of mice in the rushes. It was warm, filled with the mingled breath and body heat of many. It was watchful, for in such closeness one could not help but be aware of others. Sleeping upright in this setting was not odd but sensible, a way to balance closeness with readiness, community with caution. Even in noble households where beds were luxurious, the bedchamber itself was far from private. It was common for attendants, guards, or ladies in waiting to remain close at hand. Curtains around the bed provided seclusion, but the room itself was a public space, a stage of sorts where visitors might be received and business conducted. The upright posture suited this too, for it allowed the lord or lady to converse, to appear dignified even while at rest. In this sense, posture was part of social performance, a reminder that the bed was not hidden away, but placed within the rhythms of social life. To us, the idea of sharing a bed with strangers or sitting up half awake in a crowded chamber seems uncomfortable. But in the medieval world, comfort was measured differently. Warmth, safety, and readiness mattered more than softness or privacy. Sleeping together was simply practical, conserving heat and space. Upright posture was part of this practicality, a way to make do with crowded conditions and to remain partially alert in a night that was never entirely trusted. The bed, then, was not merely a piece of furniture, but a reflection of medieval life itself, communal, symbolic, practical, and public. It told a story of class, for the difference between straw on the floor and a feather-filled mattress was immense. It told a story of community, for beds were shared spaces rather than private retreats, and it told a story of posture, for upright sleeping was shaped not just by fear or superstition, but by the very arrangements of the night. As we close this section, picture once more the layers of medieval sleep. In a peasant's cottage, the family huddles together on straw, propped against the wall for comfort. In an inn, strangers doze warily side by side, sitting half upright as much in caution as in weariness. In a castle chamber, nobles rest upon cushions, their heads supported by bolsters, servants close at hand. In a monastery, rows of monks recline in modest order, their posture reflecting humility and discipline. Across all these settings, sleep is shared, watched, and communal. Upright posture, far from strange, was simply part of the way medieval people made their peace with the night. Inside the stone walls of medieval monasteries, where candlelight flickered against cold arches and prayers echoed through cloisters, sleep was never a private indulgence. It was instead a discipline, carefully measured and shaped by devotion. To step into the sleeping quarters of a Benedictine or Cistercian monastery is to glimpse a rhythm of life where even rest was an act of obedience to God. The night was not simply a time of slumber, but a sacred portion of the divine order. Every breath, every hour, even the turning of bodies upon wooden cots was drawn into the great tapestry of prayer and service. Monks lived according to the rule of Saint Benedict, written in the 6th century, and carried into countless monasteries across medieval Europe. This rule was not merely a guide for prayer and work, but a map for every aspect of existence, including sleep. Unlike the lay villagers outside monastery walls, who might rest to recover from exhausting fieldwork, monks were taught that sleep was a tool, a resource to be rationed, and at times a temptation to resist. Too much rest was considered laziness, even a spiritual weakness. Too little, however, could weaken the body, and thus the service owed to God. Balance was the Benedictine ideal, and balance was sought even in the silence of the dormitory. The monks' dormitories were usually long, echoing chambers lined with simple beds. There were no soft mattresses, no pillows stuffed with down, no personal curtains for privacy. Instead, the beds were hard wooden frames or pallets of straw, set out in neat rows. Privacy was discouraged. To live as a monk meant to surrender the self, and even the act of sleeping was communal, a reminder that individuality dissolved in the service of the greater brotherhood. When a monk lay down, he did not enter the private world of dreams alone, but joined a silent, breathing congregation of bodies, resting side by side. The hour of retiring was not their own to choose. Monastic bells governed all. Around sunset, after the final prayers of Compline, monks filed into their dormitory in quiet procession. There was no idle conversation, no wandering thoughts spoken aloud. Silence was the law, and silence settled on them like the heavy folds of their woolen habits. The monks undressed only partially, often keeping their robes on, for they were expected to be ready at any moment for the midnight summons of prayer. The night was divided, not into the deep, unbroken rest we might crave today, but into intervals carefully marked by ritual. For when the bell rang in the dead of night, at midnight, or sometimes nearer to 2 in the morning, the monks would rise. Sleep broken, eyes heavy, they slipped from their beds, and gathered in the dim-lit chapel for the office of matins, the longest and most solemn of the nighttime prayers. Imagine it, 100 feet shuffling over cold stone floors, the breath of weary men rising in white clouds in the chill air, voices murmuring psalms as candle flames sputtered. The stillness of the monastery was pierced not by the sounds of dreams, but by the chant of voices carried upward to heaven. After matins, sometimes lasting an hour or more, the monks returned to their beds. Here the pattern of segmented sleep was firmly in practice. Their slumber was not a single block, but was split in two, echoing the older traditions of lay society outside. This first sleep, broken by prayer, was followed by what they called a second sleep, a return to rest until the bell of lauds at dawn. It was a rhythm of waking and sleeping that intertwined seamlessly with their devotion, making their very nights a cycle of prayer and surrender. This pattern of interrupted sleep, while seemingly harsh, held deeper meaning. For monks it mirrored the eternal watchfulness expected of the faithful. To wake in the darkest hours was to imitate Christ's vigil in Gethsemane, to remain spiritually alert against the creeping danger of sin. The night, after all, was seen as the domain of temptation and demons, a time when vigilance was required. Rising in prayer was not just discipline, it was a shield. The position in which monks slept also reflected their discipline. Like many medieval people, they often rested in an upright or semi-reclined posture, supported by cushions or the incline of their bedding. It was believed that lying fully flat was a posture too close to death, inappropriate for the living. Upright sleeping allowed quicker rising for prayers, but it also symbolized a state of readiness. To fall into deep sprawling slumber was to risk indulgence. Instead, the monk's sleep was a kind of half-sleep, controlled, measured, intentional. The atmosphere of the dormitory carried its own spiritual weight. No fire was allowed, even in the harshest winters, for warmth was seen as a luxury. The cold instead was a trial of endurance, sharpening the monk's soul against weakness. Monks slept fully clothed, not only for readiness, but also to endure the bitter air as part of their discipline. To sleep shivering was paradoxically a form of prayer, a sacrifice of comfort offered to God. The silence of the dormitory was broken only by the occasional cough, the rustle of robes, or the faint creak of beds. In that silence, monks carried themselves into dreams, but even dreams were not exempt from moral scrutiny. For medieval thinkers believed that the dreams of monks revealed the state of their souls. A pure monk should dream of holy things, of saints and scripture, of light and angels. To dream of earthly pleasures or temptations was cause for confession and concern. Thus, even unconsciousness was not entirely private. It was woven into the monastic life, a reflection of inner struggles, a battleground between virtue and sin. Daily, the cycle repeated. Sunset brought Compline, the bell brought slumber, midnight brought matins, and dawn brought lauds. Through this rhythm, the monastery became a world of ordered nights, where the chaos of human restlessness was subdued beneath the steady hand of devotion. Sleep was not about personal refreshment, but about participating in the eternal rhythm of prayer. To live as a monk was to surrender even the most intimate rhythms of the body to the service of God. Yet, while austere, The monks' sleeping habits left a deep imprint on medieval culture at large. Their segmented sleep mirrored the broader practices of ordinary folk, giving them legitimacy and structure. Their upright posture, their cold dormitories, their midnight vigils, all reinforced the sense that rest was not a retreat, but an extension of duty. Lay people outside monastery walls might not rise for matins, but they heard the bells in the dark, and were reminded that while they slept, others prayed for their souls. Thus the monastic night was more than a private matter. It was a beacon, a spiritual rhythm that echoed beyond cloisters, shaping the wider imagination of medieval Europe. The monk, asleep in his hard wooden bed, rising groggy but obedient at midnight, embodied the ideal of vigilance, of readiness, of surrender. His dreams, his posture, his silence, all were folded into the greater story of a world where even sleep was never just sleep, but a sacred act. And so to step quietly into the dormitory of monks is to hear not only the whispers of men drifting in and out of segmented slumber, but also the beating heart of a civilization where rest was prayer and dreams were measured against eternity. In the medieval world, the boundary between medicine, superstition, and daily habit was far more fluid than in our modern age. To understand why so many people believed in the virtue of sleeping upright, one must step inside the medieval imagination, an imagination filled with humors, vapors, and unseen forces thought to shape health and destiny. For the medieval sleeper, the position of the body at night was not just a matter of comfort, it was a matter of survival, of health, of ensuring the fragile balance of life itself. Imagine a candlelit chamber. The physician, draped in dark robes, leans over a manuscript, illuminated with gold leaf. In his hand he holds a quill dipped in ink, writing down words of wisdom copied from the ancients, Hippocrates, Galen, Avicenna. These men of medicine, though separated by centuries and cultures, shared a common conviction: the body was governed by fluids, the four humors, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Illness was not an accident, but an imbalance, and posture, even during sleep, could shift these humors dangerously. In such a world, lying completely flat was viewed with suspicion. Physicians warned that reclining too low could cause the humors to stagnate, the lungs to fill with phlegm, the stomach to fail in its digestion. Upright posture, on the other hand, was believed to allow vapors to rise naturally, and blood to circulate with greater freedom. Thus the habit of propped-up slumber was cloaked in the authority of science, or at least the science as it was then understood. One of the most persistent concerns was the danger of suffocation. Medieval texts are filled with references to the night air, thought to be thick, heavy, and capable of pressing upon the chest if one reclined too far back. Physicians advised that sleep should be taken in moderation, in a posture that protected the breath. Breath, after all, was life itself, spiritus, the vital essence. To fall asleep flat on one's back seemed reckless, even inviting disaster. But there was another fear, one tied not only to the lungs, but to the stomach. Digestion was seen as a fire burning within the belly. After the evening meal, often heavy with bread, meat, or pottage, the stomach was thought to labor like a hearth, smoldering and transforming food into sustenance. Lying down too soon after supper risked extinguishing that fire, or causing vapors to rise improperly. An upright posture, especially in the hours immediately following dinner, was recommended to ensure smooth digestion and to prevent bad humors from spreading through the body. Thus propped sleeping was not simply a comfort, it was a medical precaution. We can imagine a medieval household following these rules as naturally as we brush our teeth before bed. After supper, a father might advise his children not to lie too flat, warning them that to do so would invite illness. A mother might tuck in her little ones, with extra cushions behind their backs, whispering a charm against suffocation. Even the poor, though they lacked physicians and books, absorbed these warnings through word of mouth. Medicine filtered down into folklore, and folklore seeped back into daily practice. Beyond the humors, another realm of belief colored the nightly posture of medieval people: the influence of spirits and dreams. It was widely thought that evil entities, demons, night hags, or malevolent vapors, could more easily visit those who lay flat, still, and unguarded. Sitting upright was, in a sense, a posture of vigilance, a way of keeping watch even while surrendering to sleep. It suggested readiness, an openness of the senses that might ward off the suffocating pressure of the supernatural. Dreams, too, were believed to be influenced by posture. Physicians sometimes prescribed sleeping upright to prevent nightmares, which were thought to arise from indigestion or from wandering spirits pressing upon the sleeper. Another dimension of health rituals came in the form of nightly purifications. Herbal remedies were often consumed before bed, infusions of chamomile, valerian, or fennel, each believed to soothe the stomach or calm the restless mind. To accompany these herbs, posture was prescribed. A cup of warm ale, spiced with cloves, might be followed by instructions: sit upright, breathe gently, let the humors settle. Ritual and remedy walked hand in hand. Nor were these beliefs confined to peasants or townsfolk. In the great halls of the nobility, where feather beds and carved wooden chairs replaced straw and simple pallets, the same fears persisted. Kings and queens, lords and ladies, all were governed by the same bodily laws, the same fragile humors. Their physicians, often educated in the universities of Paris, Bologna, or Salerno, repeated the same warnings: sleep upright, protect the lungs, guard against the night vapors. It was not a matter of wealth or class, but of universal vulnerability. It is worth noting, too, how these practices shaped the very design of the medieval bed. Many beds were not simply flat frames with mattresses, but structures that could be inclined or supported with bolsters. In some households, beds were constructed with raised backs or headboards, designed to hold pillows in place, allowing the sleeper to remain partially upright. In monasteries, monks often slept in chairs or against wooden rests, their posture doubling as both discipline and health practice. What seems strange to us, choosing to sleep upright, was perfectly natural to them, embedded in furniture, ritual, and expectation. Looking back, we might smile at the thought of humors and vapors, of fears that lying flat might suffocate the breath. Yet within these beliefs lies a deeper truth. Sleep for the medieval person was never trivial. It was not a casual collapse into unconsciousness, but a delicate passage, a vulnerable threshold that required guidance and protection. Upright sleep, with its blend of medical reasoning, spiritual caution, and nightly ritual, reveals how seriously our ancestors treated the act of rest, and perhaps we should not dismiss their wisdom too quickly. Modern science tells us that certain conditions, such as asthma, reflux, or sleep apnea, can indeed be eased by sleeping at an incline. Though the language of humors has faded, the intuition behind upright sleep has not entirely lost its relevance. What we see in the medieval world is not ignorance but an attempt, however imperfect, to make sense of the body, to find safety in a world where illness could strike at any time, and death was never far away. Thus, when we picture the medieval sleeper, propped up on cushions, head resting against a wooden board, we glimpse not only their strangeness, but their humanity. They too longed for rest, they too feared the vulnerability of night. Their rituals, shaped by medicine and myth, were not eccentric quirks, but earnest strategies for survival. In that quiet posture, half-seated, half-reclining, we find the echo of 1,000 whispered warnings, the weight of centuries of belief, and the tender care of generations seeking nothing more than a safe and healing sleep. Why did medieval people so often choose to sleep propped up, rather than lying completely flat? The answers lie not only in practical concerns, but also in the medical and spiritual worldview of the Middle Ages. To understand why the medieval sleeper arranged themselves with head and chest elevated, we must step inside their understanding of health, the workings of the human body, and the spiritual risks believed to lurk in the vulnerable hours of the night. Medieval medicine, though primitive by modern standards, was not random guesswork. It was rooted in the theories of ancient physicians, particularly the writings of Hippocrates and Galen, which had been translated, preserved, and expanded upon in both the Islamic world and Christian Europe. According to the dominant theory of humors, the human body was governed by 4 fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Health was achieved through balance, while disease came from imbalance. Every aspect of daily life, food, drink, climate, activity, and yes, even posture during sleep, was thought to influence this balance. Sleeping fully flat, many physicians argued, disrupted the natural order of the body, If a person lay flat on their back, fluids could pool or travel in ways that were thought dangerous. Phlegm, for instance, was believed to rise and choke the sleeper, causing suffocation or nightmares. Blood pooling in the head might lead to fevers, nosebleeds, or even strokes. To prop oneself up with pillows, bolsters, or the angled design of a bed was considered healthier and safer, preventing congestion and easing the body's nightly restoration. This belief was particularly strong when it came to digestion. A heavy evening meal, common in the medieval household, sat uneasily in the stomach. Physicians warned that lying flat would prevent food from settling properly, causing indigestion, bloating, or the dreaded night vapors that could cloud the brain and disturb dreams. An inclined posture, by contrast, was thought to assist the downward motion of digestion and protect the sleeper from illness. For a medieval audience, this was not merely a matter of comfort, but of survival. But medicine alone does not explain why sleeping upright became so widespread. The medieval world was also profoundly spiritual, and nighttime was a time of both vulnerability and danger. To lie completely flat, eyes closed and arms at the side, too closely resembled the posture of the corpse. Death and sleep were linked in both symbolism and imagination, and a person stretched out as if in a grave was thought to invite death itself, or at least its spiritual shadow. By sleeping half upright, with head raised, the sleeper avoided resembling the dead and maintained a posture closer to that of watchfulness, even in slumber. Religious symbolism reinforced this idea. Sleep was seen as a time when the soul could be influenced by forces both divine and demonic. Dreams could carry messages from God or temptations from the devil. A body lying flat and still was imagined as defenseless, while one slightly raised seemed more prepared, as though the soul itself remained alert. Monks and holy men were often depicted as sleeping propped up, sitting almost like sentinels, resisting the pull of sloth and deathly stillness. There was also the matter of breathing. Many medieval physicians, and the people who trusted them, believed that the breath carried not only life, but spiritual purity. To breathe badly during the night was not just a health risk, but a moral one. Lying flat was thought to obstruct the breath and invite corruption of both body and soul. Sleeping upright allowed air to flow more freely, guarding against both suffocation and spiritual impurity. Consider too the importance of posture in a world deeply shaped by ritual and symbolism. The seated posture was linked to authority, dignity, and readiness. Kings held court sitting upon thrones, judges dispensed rulings seated, and monks prayed upright in their stalls. To recline completely flat was associated with weakness, idleness, and ultimately death. Thus the choice to sleep half upright was not simply medical, it was social and spiritual, a continuation of daytime order into the night. Practical concerns blended seamlessly with these beliefs. Fires smoked, households were noisy, children often shared beds with parents, and animals were kept indoors. Sleeping raised on pillows, bolsters, or bed frames meant one could more easily breathe, hear, and even speak during the night. Medieval life was filled with interruptions, prayers, dangers, disturbances, and an upright posture made it easier to awaken suddenly if needed. A thief, a fire, or even a spiritual vision might come at any hour, and the sleeper had to be ready. Medical manuscripts of the period give us fascinating detail about recommended sleeping postures. Some advise that one should begin the night on the right side to encourage digestion, and later turn to the left side to balance the humors. Elevation of the head was consistently advised, often to prevent the fumes of the stomach from rising to the brain. Monastic rules likewise often instructed brothers to rest in ways that discouraged deep indulgent slumber. The body, they believed, should never sink so deeply into sleep that it forgot its higher calling. This intersection of medical theory and spiritual symbolism reveals just how different the medieval night was from our own. Today we value the image of complete rest, the body stretched out on a mattress, surrendered to unconsciousness. For the medieval sleeper, however, the night was not a time to surrender fully, but to maintain balance, balance of humors, balance of spirit, balance between life and death itself. Upright sleep embodied that balance, protective for the body, prepared for the soul, and symbolic of a world that never truly rested. Imagine then the sight of a medieval bedchamber. The hearth glows faintly, shadows dance on the walls, and in the carved bedstead a figure reclines, but not flat. Propped upon pillows or a wooden backboard, the sleeper breathes carefully, their posture chosen with intent. They are not only protecting their digestion and circulation, but also signaling to themselves, their household, and to unseen powers that they remain watchful. Even in sleep they resist the pull of death, of chaos, of the grave-like stillness that complete rest might bring. In this way, the medieval preference for semi-upright sleep can be seen as a window into an entire worldview. It shows us how health, spirituality, and symbolism intertwined seamlessly, how the body and the soul were never separate concerns but part of the same fragile whole. The choice of posture was not trivial but essential, a nightly act of both medicine and faith. And so when we ask why medieval people so often slept sitting up, the answer is not a single reason but a tapestry of many: the humors of the body, the fears of the soul, and the symbolism of life itself, continuing even in darkness. Sleep in the medieval imagination was never just a biological necessity. It was a canvas upon which ideas of the soul, morality, and destiny were painted. To the modern world, sitting upright while sleeping might seem merely uncomfortable or inconvenient. Yet, in the Middle Ages, posture in slumber carried symbolic weight, and the act of sleeping upright could speak to deeper cultural and spiritual meanings. It was not only how the body rested, but also how the soul was believed to prepare for what lay beyond wakefulness. To sleep upright was in many ways a declaration. It mirrored the posture of prayer, with the body poised halfway between earth and heaven. Monks, clerics, and layfolk alike often envisioned their nightly rest as a rehearsal for death, a kind of living metaphor for what would one day come. If lying flat resembled the grave, sitting upright evoked a state of readiness, the soul watchful, even when the body yielded to fatigue. It suggested vigilance, as though one's spirit kept guard, while the body slumbered. In medieval Christian thought, the body was never separate from the soul. Each action, each posture, could carry symbolic resonance. Sleeping upright was associated with humility, since the sleeper did not sprawl luxuriously, but instead confined themselves within rigid boundaries. It was a visible expression of restraint, a rejection of indulgence. This was particularly true within monastic communities, where moderation in all things was considered essential. To lie down flat, to stretch across a bed in ease, could be seen as bordering on excess, a danger to the disciplined life. The image of the upright sleeper also paralleled the knight on vigil, before a battle. On the eve of knighthood, or before a campaign, warriors would sometimes spend the night in prayer, kneeling or sitting upright in meditation. In this way, upright rest became entangled with the values of watchfulness, courage, and readiness to act. Sleep was not abandonment, but anticipation. A knight who dozed upright seemed always half awake, a sentinel in his own chamber, as if the duties of honor and faith could not be abandoned even in dreams. Art and literature of the period reinforced this symbolism. Illuminated manuscripts often depicted saints in upright postures during visions, suggesting that true divine dreams occurred not when one was fully prone, but when one hovered between waking and rest. Upright sleep was liminal, poised on the threshold. It suggested a kind of openness, as if the soul, hovering just above the body's heaviness, could more easily encounter angels, saints, or divine truth. We can also see how upright sleep carried echoes of resurrection. In Christian belief, the dead would one day rise from their graves to face judgment. Sleep itself was likened to death, a temporary parting of the soul from the body, awaiting the dawn like the soul awaiting resurrection. By sleeping upright, the body seemed already prepared to rise. It gave the impression of a soul standing watch for the trumpet of the last day. Medieval men and women often wove these theological meanings into the mundane habits of life, and the way they slept was no exception. Yet, beyond theology, upright sleep also contained subtle social signals. To sleep upright in a chair or a corner of a room could suggest poverty, a lack of resources to afford a spacious bed. For peasants who worked long hours and returned home to cramped cottages, upright dozing by the fire was not uncommon. This accidental form of upright rest was reinterpreted by moralists as a symbol of humility. It blurred the lines between necessity and virtue, what the poor did by need, the religious reframed as spiritual discipline. Thus, upright sleep could embody both hardship and holiness, depending on who was watching. There is, too, a psychological layer. Upright sleep may have been seen as a gesture of control over vulnerability. To lie flat, eyes closed, body defenseless, was to surrender wholly. To remain upright was to retain a fragment of authority, to resist total submission. In an age preoccupied with dangers, of thieves in the night, of fire, of sudden illness or death, upright posture suggested readiness. It was a body refusing to be caught unawares. Even in sleep, the upright sleeper seemed to whisper, "I am not undone, I remain alert." Legends sometimes emphasized this theme. Folklore recounted holy men or ascetics who never lay down, sleeping instead on their feet or sitting against stone walls. Their upright posture became proof of sanctity, a visible badge of endurance against bodily weakness. Tales of hermits who resisted the temptation of comfort by sleeping only upright circulated widely, casting this posture as heroic. The message was clear: upright sleep was no accident, but a sign of moral strength, a triumph of will over flesh. For medieval audiences steeped in symbolism, such meanings would have been instinctive. Posture in sleep was not dismissed as trivial, just as gestures during prayer carried weight. The folding of hands, the bowing of the head, so too did the orientation of the body in rest. Uprightness implied moral uprightness, the visible alignment of body and soul. It became a posture that communicated not only to those around the sleeper, but also, perhaps most importantly, to God. Even the language of the time reflected these associations. Phrases like watchful rest or vigilant slumber conveyed the paradox of sleeping while not fully surrendering. Upright posture embodied this paradox. It made sleep less like a fall and more like a pause, and in this pause, medieval men and women saw significance, an act that bridged earth and eternity. Thus, when we consider why medieval people sometimes slept upright, we must remember that their world was rich with layers of meaning. It was not merely about health, or comfort, or architecture. It was about the drama of existence itself. The way ordinary acts like eating, dressing, or sleeping reflected the grand questions of life, death, and salvation. Upright sleep became, in this context, more than rest. It was symbol, statement, and story all at once. To us today, lying down flat on a soft mattress feels like the most natural way to fall asleep. It is the very image of rest and comfort. Yet for medieval people, this posture was not just unusual, it was considered dangerous, even reckless. To stretch out one's body entirely horizontal and vulnerable seemed to invite both physical ailments and spiritual perils. Understanding this fear requires us to slip into their mindset, a world where science, religion, and superstition blended seamlessly, shaping the most intimate aspects of life, even the way one closed their eyes at night. The first danger they feared was suffocation. Without the modern understanding of respiratory health, many medieval people believed that lying completely flat pressed the lungs and chest in such a way that breathing became more difficult. A reclined seated posture, they thought, kept the chest open and allowed for a freer, safer passage of air. In smoky, cramped homes where fires smoldered and ventilation was poor, this concern did not feel irrational. The fear of choking on one's own breath in the night, with no one to hear or help, loomed large in the imagination. Another fear was the accumulation of dangerous bodily humors. Medieval medicine, guided by the theory of the four humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, taught that balance was the foundation of health. To lie flat, they believed, was to invite these fluids to stagnate or pool in harmful ways. Phlegm, for instance, might rise into the throat or chest, leading to coughing, suffocation, or fever. Blood might rush to the head, producing headaches, or even apoplexy. In this worldview, posture mattered just as much as diet, herbs, or remedies, and sleeping upright was a way to protect the delicate equilibrium of the body. Then there was the spiritual dimension. Death and sleep were often seen as close cousins, intertwined in both language and symbolism. To lie flat on one's back was the posture of the corpse, the final stillness of burial. For many medieval people, stretching out as if already laid in a grave, carried an ominous weight. To sleep in such a way might tempt fate, almost as if rehearsing for one's own funeral. The superstition was simple: the more you mimicked death, the more likely death was to come for you. This belief was reinforced by the Church's teachings. In medieval sermons and moral texts, writers often warned that sin, temptation, and even demonic visitations could come most easily to those who slept unwisely. Sleeping flat, with the body limp and the spirit unguarded, was said to leave a soul vulnerable to evil influence. Sitting up, or at least reclining at an angle, symbolized wakefulness and vigilance, even in slumber. It was a way of telling the world, and perhaps oneself, that the spirit remained alert, not lulled into the dangerous oblivion of a corpse-like sleep. But the dangers were not only spiritual or medical, they were also practical. Lying flat on the floor, or on a low bed in a medieval home, meant being closer to drafts, vermin, and the dampness of the earth. Fleas, rats, and crawling insects were a constant nuisance. Smoke from the hearth might settle low in the room, choking those who slept near the ground. Damp air rising from the floor could bring chills or rheumatism. To elevate the body and remain partly upright was a matter of physical survival as much as comfort. Even architecture played a role. Many medieval houses had uneven floors or sleeping spaces near open hearths. Lying flat might put one in the direct path of smoke, sparks, or cold winds slipping through the cracks of wooden walls. A semi-seated posture, often supported by bolsters or wooden bed frames, designed with angled backs, offered protection from these household hazards. What seems awkward to us was, for them, a form of everyday caution. Accounts from the time confirm these concerns. In medical treatises, physicians wrote of the dangers of lying long supine, warning that it encouraged the vapors of the stomach to rise toward the brain, causing nightmares or madness. Chroniclers described kings, nobles, and even saints who adopted semi-upright sleep, praising it as a mark of prudence and discipline. The sleeping posture of the body became a moral choice as much as a medical one, reflecting character as well as caution. Interestingly, this caution about lying flat was not entirely misplaced. Modern medicine shows that conditions like acid reflux, sleep apnea, or congestion can indeed worsen when lying completely horizontal. Sleeping on an incline can reduce these symptoms. Though medieval explanations were wrapped in humors and superstition, their instincts sometimes overlapped with truths we recognize today. Their nightly posture, then, was not simply a relic of ignorance, but a response to real discomforts and dangers, filtered through the lens of their worldview. The symbolism of posture also carried through rituals of health and piety. Monks who lived lives of strict discipline often slept upright in wooden stalls, leaning slightly against supports as a sign of humility and vigilance. Their refusal to recline fully was both a spiritual exercise and a health precaution, keeping them ready for midnight prayers. Knights, too, were sometimes depicted sleeping seated in armor, poised as though even in dreams they remained guardians. The idea that to lie flat was to surrender, to danger, to death, to sin, ran deep in the culture, and yet, there were exceptions. In wealthier households, where beds were raised high off the ground, filled with straw or feather mattresses, and draped in thick curtains to block drafts, some did dare to sleep more horizontally. These chambers offered safety from vermin, warmth from the cold, and distance from the smoky floor. Here in the upper echelons of medieval society, lying down flat became more acceptable, though even then many chose a semi-reclined posture, out of habit or caution. It was only with time and changing beliefs that fully horizontal sleep would become the norm across all classes. For the medieval mind, then, lying flat was not the restful image it is for us. It was fraught with danger, of suffocation, imbalance, corruption, sin, or death. To sleep upright was to guard the body, mind and soul against unseen perils. It was a nightly act of survival, in a world where the boundary between life and death, health and illness, salvation and damnation felt fragile and uncertain. In every posture, in every restless shift of the night, the medieval sleeper carried with them centuries of inherited fears and wisdom. Thus, when we imagine a medieval household settling in for the night, we should not picture neat rows of bodies lying peacefully, as we do today. Instead, we should see figures propped up against cushions, heads tilted forward, cloaked in shadow and firelight, sleeping as if half awake. For them, sleep was not abandonment, it was vigilance, not a surrender to stillness, but a guarded crossing into the uncertain hours of darkness. The medieval night was not only about the body finding rest, it was equally about the mind journeying into realms unseen. To sleep upright was to place oneself in a liminal state between waking and dreaming, balanced precariously between the tangible world and the mysterious landscapes of imagination. When a peasant or noble leaned against a bedpost or sat upright by the fire, their body was partially at ease, yet their senses remained faintly alert. This created an unusual condition, a kind of half-waking dream where the boundary between reality and vision seemed thinner. Medieval people did not regard dreams as random flickers of the brain. They treated them as messages. A dream could come from God, from angels, from saints, or more ominously, from demons lurking in the shadows of the night. To dream while sitting upright, eyes closed but head raised, was considered especially potent. This posture was linked with vigilance, and so the dreams experienced in that state carried a weight of importance. Unlike the sprawling dreams of deep sleep, when one lay fully down, the upright dream seemed sharper, more symbolic, more like a visitation. In monasteries, monks described waking visions after midnight prayers. Their bodies, upright and still, would enter a drowsy state. It was here in this middle realm that they reported seeing Christ, the Virgin Mary, or angels appearing with words of comfort or warning. Entire mystical traditions grew out of such experiences. For the monastic world, dreams seen while upright were almost a second scripture, living lessons sent directly from heaven. The stillness of the body mirrored the stillness of the soul, making the upright dream a sacred channel. Among ordinary people, the upright dream had a more practical meaning. If a farmer, sleeping in a chair near the hearth, dreamed of a field lush with grain, it was taken as a sign of prosperity to come. If instead, he dreamed of dark water or broken tools, it was feared to be a warning of hardship. Women especially were thought to have powerful dream lives, sometimes believed to see future births, deaths, or illnesses in their upright visions. Folklore, passed down from village to village, taught how to interpret these nighttime messages. A black bird meant sorrow, a golden light meant blessing, and a serpent meant betrayal. Physicians of the medieval world also paid close attention to dreams. Following the traditions of Galen and Aristotle, they believed that the position of the body during sleep shaped not only the health of the organs, but also the imagery of the mind. Upright sleep, they said, prevented the stomach from being weighed down. Food digested more cleanly, the humors flowed more smoothly, and as a result the dreams became clearer. In contrast, lying flat was thought to stir up muddled, or even dangerous visions, phantoms caused by indigestion, or an excess of black bile. Upright sleep, then, was not merely a comfort, but a prescription for purity of both body and spirit. One cannot forget the darker side of medieval dream lore. Upright dreams could be angelic, but they could also be demonic. Many believed that to doze sitting upright left one exposed to the visitations of night creatures. The incubus and succubus, shadowy beings who preyed on sleepers, were said to strike those whose guard was down. Yet the upright position gave a sense of defense, as though the sleeper were still somewhat awake, ready to resist. Thus dream accounts often portray upright sleepers, struggling with temptations or fears, then awakening suddenly, crossing themselves, and thanking God that they had not lain flat and helpless. The medieval world also made space for dreams of the dead. Sitting by the fire in the silence of night, someone might nod off and see the face of a departed parent or child. This was not regarded as strange. Instead, it was treated as a visitation, a moment when the veil between the living and the dead grew thin. Upright posture was thought to allow these encounters, without the danger of being pulled too deeply into the underworld of sleep. Families sometimes prayed for such dreams, hoping to receive guidance or comfort from loved ones who had passed on. In courts and castles, dream interpretation could influence politics. Chronicles tell of kings or nobles who, after nodding into upright sleep, claimed to have seen omens that shaped decisions of war and peace. A dream of a bleeding sword, a dream of a crown falling to the ground, these were treated as serious warnings. Advisors and clerics were summoned to unravel their meanings. Entire campaigns might be delayed, or alliances shifted based on a dream glimpsed in a half-sleep by a weary ruler resting in a chair. Even poets and storytellers took inspiration from the upright dream. Medieval literature is filled with dream visions, works like The Romance of the Rose or Chaucer's dream poems, where the narrator drifts into a semi-sleeping state and is led into fantastical landscapes. While not always meant literally, these stories reflected the cultural weight of dreams. They imagined the upright sleeper as a traveler stepping across the threshold of reality into a world of allegory and mystery. To read such tales was to imagine oneself dozing by a candle, eyes closing as the boundary between story and vision dissolved. Beyond the walls of monasteries, homes and courts, dreams also carried communal meaning. Villagers sometimes interpreted shared dreams as signs for the whole community. If several people dozing upright around the same hearth dreamed of fire or flood, the village took precautions. Dreams were woven into the fabric of medieval survival, part superstition, part tradition, part hope, part fear. In this way, upright sleep became more than a physical posture, it was a gateway to the unseen. To sit and drift into slumber was to place oneself on the edge of two worlds, the waking and the dreaming. It gave the medieval mind the assurance that even in sleep, one was participating in a grand, mysterious order. Each dream carried meaning. Each vision, whether hopeful or terrifying, was thought to speak of something beyond the self. And so the practice endured. Night after night, across centuries, upright dreamers waited for the flicker of vision, the whisper of angels, the shadow of warning. The world of dreams was not distant but near, as close as the next nod of the head, the next closing of the eyes. For medieval people, to sleep upright was not merely to rest the body, it was to step into a sacred dialogue with the unknown. When we look back at the medieval world, it is tempting to assume that their habits were guided only by superstition or necessity, without any deeper understanding. Yet the practice of sleeping upright reveals something fascinating, a kind of intuitive science. Medieval people may not have had laboratories, medical journals or controlled studies, but their bodies and daily rhythms guided them toward choices that were surprisingly aligned with certain truths about human biology. To fall asleep in a chair, or propped against pillows, was not just convenience, it carried subtle connections to posture, breathing, and the mysterious cycles of sleep. Let us begin with the posture itself. Sitting upright, or reclining at an angle, changes the way the diaphragm works. When lying flat, the weight of the body presses more heavily against the lungs, especially in an age before modern bedding made rest so soft. Upright sleeping relieved some of this pressure. For someone with asthma, breathing difficulties, or even just the heaviness of a full stomach from a late-night meal, the vertical position could bring relief. Medieval people may not have known the word airway, but they knew what comfort felt like, and so posture was a quiet kind of medicine. This posture also influenced the circulation of blood. In medieval thought, the body was understood, through the theory of humors, fluids that needed balance. Though the theory was wrong by modern standards, the observations it produced were often rooted in lived experience. Sleeping upright reduced pressure on the heart and head. For someone prone to dizziness, headaches, or the unsettling throb of high blood pressure, sitting up would have felt better. In this way, medieval sleepers found balance, not through theory, but through trial and error. But beyond comfort, the act of sleeping upright changed the rhythm of the night. Today we know that the body cycles through different stages of sleep: light sleep, deep sleep, and the dreaming state of REM. These cycles repeat several times, shaping the night into patterns of rest and renewal. When lying flat in a warm bed, we may pass more deeply and continuously into these stages. But when propped upright, the body resists sinking fully into the depths of unconsciousness. Sleep becomes lighter, more fragmented, easier to interrupt and resume. This is where the medieval world's unique rhythm, first sleep and second sleep, emerges again. Upright sleeping made the body more prepared for waking in the middle of the night. The mind did not sink into such heavy depths that rising felt unnatural. Instead, one could drift into waking, pray, reflect, or even talk with family, and then return easily to dozing again. It was a posture that mirrored the rhythm of segmented nights. The science of posture aligned with the culture of sleep. We must also think of digestion, a concern both then and now. Medieval diets were hearty, often filled with bread, meats and thick stews. To lie flat on a full stomach brought discomfort, and as they often described it, bad humors. Sitting upright allowed food to settle. It may have reduced the sensation of reflux, though they had no word for it. Once again, their instincts were quietly aligned with the mechanics of the body. Consider, too, the world of the mind. Upright sleeping kept a person closer to waking consciousness. Dreams may have been different in this position, lighter, easier to recall, and perhaps more vivid. Medieval people often gave great importance to dreams, seeing them as messages, warnings, or glimpses into the unseen. A posture that kept them close to waking may have encouraged these dream states, lingering in the borderland between sleeping and waking. The upright position also had its costs. Deep rest, the kind that restores the body most fully, is less likely when the body does not lie flat. The muscles cannot relax completely. The weight of the head pulls against the neck. Over years, this may have left people weary or stiff. Yet in a world where life itself was harsh, where rest was interrupted by noise, cold, and obligation, perhaps perfect rest was never the expectation. Sleep was not about luxury, it was about survival, about what worked in a world of constant demand. And so we see a curious blend, instinct, tradition, and the beginnings of science. Medieval people did not separate body and spirit as we often do today. To them, the position of sleep could influence dreams, health, and even the soul's safety. Physicians wrote of humors, priests warned of demons, and common folk trusted what their bodies told them. Together, this created a worldview in which posture was never just physical, it was a part of life's balance. If we compare their habits to ours, we may even find reflections of this science in modern practice. Hospital patients, for instance, are often propped upright to ease breathing. Those with certain conditions are told not to lie flat. Travelers on long journeys doze sitting up. These practices are not born from superstition, but from the needs of the body. In a sense, the medieval world was already there, living out of necessity what we sometimes rediscover in study. The cycles of sleep, too, have modern echoes. Researchers have studied segmented sleep, noting that the human body can adapt to it, that perhaps it is even natural in certain conditions. The medieval upright posture supported this rhythm, and so it endured for centuries. When the modern world shifted toward flat beds and consolidated nights, the body adjusted again, but perhaps at the cost of something once familiar, a lighter, more flexible relationship with sleep. And so, as we reflect on the science of posture and cycles, we see that the medieval world was not as ignorant as it might first appear. Their nights were not simply shaped by fear, poverty, or discomfort, but by choices that aligned with their body's needs. Upright sleeping was not foolishness, it was in many ways wisdom born of necessity. It allowed them to breathe easier, digest better, wake more naturally, and live in harmony with a rhythm now mostly forgotten. This understanding draws us closer to them across the centuries, for in their upright posture, in their segmented nights, we see not only the strangeness of history, but also the deep continuity of the human body. We too seek comfort, renewal, and the peace of dreams. And though our beds are softer, our nights longer, the same rhythms lie hidden within us. The medieval world reminds us of what it means to listen to the body, to follow instinct, to adapt, and to find rest even in the most unlikely of positions. Intuitive and private sleep we know today is not one of abrupt revolution, but of gradual evolution. Each stage changes in architecture, textiles, medicine, privacy and culture, each layering upon the other over centuries. It is also a reminder that even the most personal habits are never entirely personal. The way we sleep is shaped by the world we live in, the houses we build, the knowledge we share, the fears we hold, and the comforts we desire. In this sense, the bed is both a resting place and a mirror of history, holding within its quiet folds the echoes of centuries of change. The medieval world, for all its rigid traditions and deeply ingrained patterns of living, was never a place entirely frozen in time. Customs shifted, ideas traveled, and slow, almost imperceptible changes crept into daily life, reshaping even the most intimate of practices, such as the way people slept. The story of how humanity moved from the upright, segmented, and often communal sleep of the Middle Ages to the flat, continuous and private sleep we know today is not one of abrupt revolution, but of gradual evolution. Each century carried with it subtle alterations, nudged along by climate, culture, religion, science, and technology. By the dawn of the early modern era, the very idea of sitting up in bed through the night had largely slipped away, replaced by something closer to our own nightly rituals. The first and most obvious factor in this transition was the transformation of domestic architecture. As Europe moved into the late Middle Ages and the early Renaissance, houses began to change in both design and function. Wealthier families, particularly in cities, built homes with multiple stories, sturdier walls, and more efficient chimneys. These changes provided insulation and warmth, reducing the need for upright sleeping as a defense against cold. When the hearth moved from the center of the hall to the corner of a private chamber, it altered the very dynamics of sleep. No longer did people huddle together for warmth in great numbers. Instead, smaller family units, or even individuals, found greater comfort in lying flat, wrapped in layered bedding, protected from the chill of the night. Bedding itself underwent a quiet revolution. In the early medieval centuries, straw pallets and coarse blankets were the norm for most, with feathers or woolen stuffing reserved for the wealthy. But by the 15th and 16th centuries, textiles improved dramatically. Wool was spun more finely, linen became more widely available, and in prosperous households, down-stuffed mattresses and pillows became prized possessions. As bedding grew softer, warmer and more supportive, lying down became not only more comfortable, but also more desirable. A body reclining on a thick mattress, supported by pillows and covered with layered quilts, could rest in a way that a sitting posture no longer matched. Social norms, too, began to shift. The communal aspect of medieval sleep slowly gave way to the concept of privacy. The medieval hall, where entire households, including servants, retainers, and even guests, often shared space, gave way to houses with designated bedrooms. The idea that each family member, or at least each couple, might have a space of their own redefined how sleep was approached. Sitting upright to maintain dignity before others mattered less when one was surrounded by only one's closest kin, or no one at all. Privacy allowed vulnerability, and vulnerability encouraged a return to the more natural, fully reclined posture. Religious and medical attitudes also evolved. For centuries, clerics and physicians had offered moral or health-related arguments for upright sleeping. Sitting helped guard against sinful dreams, aided digestion, and allowed quicker readiness for prayer. But as new medical theories entered Europe, influenced by translations of classical and Arabic texts, attitudes shifted. Physicians of the Renaissance increasingly stressed the health benefits of lying flat, where circulation was thought to be more even, the body more properly aligned, and the mind better refreshed. The spread of humanist thought emphasized harmony and balance in all things, and this extended even to the way one might ideally rest. The invention of new lighting technologies also played a role in reshaping sleep. In the medieval centuries, firelight and tallow candles created a dim, flickering world of shadows. This encouraged segmented sleep patterns, with people rising during the night for prayer, work, or even social activity, before returning to bed. But as candles improved, and later, as oil lamps became more common in the early modern period, nights grew brighter, allowing people to extend waking hours later into the evening. This delayed bedtime meant that once people did retire, they often sought uninterrupted, deeper rest, lying flat until morning, rather than waking in the middle of the night to sit or shift. Cultural exchanges accelerated these shifts. Trade, exploration, and colonization brought not only spices and silks, but also new ideas about comfort and domestic life. The importation of cotton, for example, expanded textile possibilities, while contact with cultures in Asia and the Middle East introduced new notions of furniture and luxury. Beds became larger, more elaborate, more symbolic of status. To recline upon them fully, to stretch out across wide frames piled with rich fabrics, was both a comfort and a statement of wealth. What had once been a practical adaptation to medieval living conditions, sleeping upright, began to appear old-fashioned, even rustic. By the 17th century, the old medieval habits lingered only in memory or in poorer rural communities, where change came slowly. In the growing cities of Europe, however, the image of the bed as a private sanctuary had become firmly established. Portraits of aristocrats and monarchs depicted them reclining on great canopied beds, not perched stiffly against piled cushions. Literature and diaries from the period describe long nights of rest, punctuated less by waking intervals and more by continuous slumber. Even the language of sleep shifted, with metaphors of lying down and surrendering to rest, replacing the vigilance implied by sitting up. Yet it would be a mistake to imagine this transition as smooth or universal. In many rural cottages, cramped conditions still forced multiple generations to share space, and upright sleeping remained practical when warmth was scarce. For the poor, bedding remained minimal, and straw pallets encouraged postures that were half sitting, half reclining. But the cultural tide had turned. The ideal, even if not always achievable, was a bed where one could lie flat and rest undisturbed through the night. As with so many aspects of life, the practice of the wealthy trickled down slowly, reshaping expectations across society. The shift also mirrored broader transformations in human life. As Europe moved from the medieval to the modern world, ideas of time, labor, and leisure evolved. The strict rhythms of agricultural work, tied to daylight and the seasons, began to give way to new urban schedules, shaped by trade, markets, and eventually industrial clocks. With this came the desire for more efficient restorative rest, a night's sleep that prepared one for the demands of the day. Continuous flat sleep suited this new rhythm far better than the segmented upright habits of earlier centuries. By the 18th century, the medieval memory of sitting upright through the night had become something of a curiosity, remarked upon by antiquarians, and occasionally preserved in folk traditions. The upright sleeper was now more often a traveler dozing in a coach, a soldier resting in the field, or a sick person propped for comfort. In ordinary domestic life, sleep had become what we recognize today, lying down fully stretched beneath layers of bedding, within the privacy of one's chamber. The journey from medieval upright sleep to modern reclining rest is thus a story not of sudden invention, but of patient, gradual transformation. It reflects changes in architecture, textiles, medicine, privacy, and culture, each layering upon the other over centuries. It is also a reminder that even the most personal habits are never entirely personal. The way we sleep is shaped by the world we live in, the houses we build, the knowledge we share, the fears we hold, and the comforts we desire. In this sense, the bed is both a resting place and a mirror of history, holding within its quiet folds the echoes of centuries of change. When we step back from the dimly lit chambers of medieval Europe and return to our own brightly illuminated world, the strangeness of their sleep begins to take on a surprising clarity. At first glance, the image of peasants sitting upright against the wooden beams of their cottages, or nobles resting half-reclined in grand four-poster beds, might seem like little more than a quirk of the past. But when we look deeper, the medieval approach to sleep carries within it a set of lessons, timeless reminders about the nature of rest, the fragility of human bodies, and the enduring interplay between culture and biology. In the modern world, sleep is something we often treat as a private commodity. We schedule it into our daily routines, often compressing it into 7 or 8 hours, squeezed between work obligations and entertainment. The medieval world, however, saw sleep as porous, flexible, and deeply tied to the rhythms of the community. Their sitting-up posture was not just a matter of practicality, but also a reflection of the world they inhabited. It reminds us that sleep, far from being fixed, is a cultural artifact as much as a biological necessity. One of the clearest lessons is the recognition that sleep adapts to its environment. For medieval people, the bed was not a sealed cocoon of silence and privacy, but a shared space, often communal, often filled with the noise of animals, neighbors, and street life. Sitting upright was in part an adaptation to the lack of comfort, the threat of disease, and the constant interruptions of daily life. In our own time, we often seek the perfect sleep environment, complete with blackout curtains, sound machines, and ergonomic pillows. But perhaps what the medievals can teach us is that the human body is more flexible than we imagine. Sleep need not be perfect to be restorative. It can be carved out of imperfect circumstances. Another reflection emerges when we consider the idea of segmented sleep, the two distinct phases that many medieval people described. First sleep, followed by a waking period of reflection, conversation, or prayer, and then a second sleep. This rhythm offers a striking contrast to our modern insistence on unbroken sleep. For those who suffer from insomnia today, lying awake in the middle of the night often feels like a failure, a medical problem to be solved. Yet in the medieval world, this wakefulness was not pathology, but opportunity. The midnight hours were a space for thought, intimacy, creativity, and even divine communion. To remember this is to soften our own anxiety about sleeplessness, to see wakefulness not as an enemy, but as a natural rhythm that has accompanied humanity for centuries. The upright posture of medieval sleep also speaks to the connection between rest and health. While their reasoning, that lying flat invited disease, or that spirits of illness might settle on a body in repose, was born from a pre-scientific worldview, it reflects an enduring truth: sleep and health are intimately bound together. They were cautious about posture because they instinctively sensed that the way one sleeps shapes the body's well-being. Today, science confirms what medieval intuition guessed at: posture affects breathing, circulation, and even long-term musculoskeletal health. While we may not need to sleep bolt upright to ward off the plague, their attentiveness to the physical conditions of rest can remind us not to treat sleep as something incidental. It is not simply a passive state, but an active foundation for resilience. There is also something to be learned from the spiritual dimension of medieval sleep. For them, drifting into slumber was not just the end of a tiring day, but a threshold between worlds. Sleep was closely tied to dreams, and dreams were often interpreted as divine messages, warnings, or glimpses into hidden truths. Sitting upright while sleeping made one ready, in a sense, to wake quickly, whether to tend to earthly matters, or to heed visions that might be of spiritual importance. Our modern world, though less enchanted by dream visions, still grapples with the mystery of why we dream, and what it reveals about the human mind. In remembering the reverence medieval people gave to this nightly descent, we too might pause to see our own dreams, not merely as random images, but as reflections of inner landscapes we too often ignore. Perhaps the most powerful lesson lies in how social sleep once was. In medieval times, sleeping upright was often done alongside others, in rooms filled with family, servants, or even strangers at inns. Privacy was rare, warmth and safety came from proximity. Sleep was not a solitary act, but a shared experience. Today we emphasize the personal sleep ritual, our own bed, our own time, our own comfort. But perhaps there is something deeply human in the act of shared rest, something we glimpse only in fragments: a child napping against a parent's chest, a couple falling asleep on the couch, travelers dozing shoulder to shoulder on a train. To sleep upright in company was for medieval people simply life. For us, it might serve as a reminder of the deep social bonds that underlie even the most basic acts of existence. And yet, while we can learn from their practices, we must also acknowledge the contrast between their world and ours. Their upright sleep was not born of luxury, but of necessity, of draughty houses, straw mattresses, smoky air, and cultural fears. Our modern ability to stretch out on clean sheets in climate-controlled rooms is a privilege hard-won through centuries of change. The medieval world teaches us resilience and adaptation, but it also reminds us how far we have come in mastering the material conditions of comfort. To reflect on their sleep is to cultivate gratitude for our own. Finally, the image of medieval sleep, upright, segmented, communal, invites us to see the act of rest in a broader frame. Sleep is not merely the absence of wakefulness, nor a biological chore to be completed. It is part of the story of who we are, shaped by the fears we hold, the beliefs we cherish, and the environments we inhabit. For medieval people, every posture, every midnight waking, every dream was woven into the texture of their world. For us, the act of looking back at their practices can spark a gentler, more spacious view of our own. So when you next find yourself awake at midnight, or when you shift uncomfortably in your bed, searching for rest, remember those who came before you. Remember the peasants propped against hearthside walls, the monks rising to chant in cold chapels, the nobles sitting half-reclined beneath heavy canopies. Remember that their rest was imperfect too, yet it sustained them through centuries of struggle and change. Their story is, in some sense, our story. And in reflecting on the ways they slept, we may rediscover not only the history of rest, but also the enduring wisdom hidden within it. As the centuries turned, and the medieval world edged closer to the dawn of modernity, the old rhythms of night and sleep began to unravel. For countless generations, people had gone to bed with the darkness, awakened in the middle of the night, to whisper prayers or share quiet conversations, and then settled back into their slumber until morning. They had slept in upright postures, propped by bolsters, wary of the unseen dangers of lying flat. They had ordered their nights with the certainty that sleep was not one continuous plunge into unconsciousness, but rather a journey taken in stages. And yet, as the late medieval and early Renaissance centuries unfolded, change drifted into the chambers of sleep, just as surely as it did into the cathedrals, the guild halls, and the marketplaces. The medieval way of resting would not last forever. The forces that began reshaping the world were subtle at first, yet profound in their impact. Towns grew larger, trade routes stretched wider, and with the expansion of wealth came the expansion of new habits. The invention of the mechanical clock, ringing out hours with precision, began to alter the way people perceived time itself. No longer was the night simply divided into the vague phases of darkness, with the rooster's crow marking dawn. Now the day was measured, the hours counted, and people began to think differently about the night. They started pressing sleep into a tighter mold, carving it into the schedules of a more organized society. The soft, two-part slumber so natural in the medieval world began to feel like something less practical in the cities, where work and commerce demanded punctuality. Slowly, the old patterns began to give way. Even the posture of sleep began to shift. Where once men and women had leaned into their pillows with a wary vigilance, fearing suffocation, bad humors, or unseen demons that might attack in the night, new medical thought began to ease these concerns. Physicians, inspired by ancient texts, rediscovered through Renaissance scholarship, argued that lying flat, properly supported, was not dangerous, but instead beneficial. They claimed it allowed the body to rest evenly, the lungs to expand more naturally, and the blood to flow freely. The upright slumber that had marked so many medieval nights began to seem less necessary, less tied to survival. As knowledge changed, so did the very shape of the night's rest. Another great shift came with the presence of artificial light. For most of the medieval era, night was thick with darkness, broken only by the flicker of hearths, torches or candles. Yet the cost of wax and tallow kept such light scarce, precious, reserved for the wealthy, or for moments of true need. For the majority, the night was a dominion of shadows, but with the later centuries came new means of illumination. Oil lamps grew more common, candles more affordable, and the very nature of night was altered. Instead of surrendering to darkness and structuring their lives around it, people pushed back against it. They read, they wrote, they prayed for longer stretches. In this gradual brightening of the night, the medieval habit of segmented sleep began to erode. Why rise for a midnight vigil, when light allowed you to remain awake longer into the evening? Why divide sleep into two halves, when the dark hours themselves could be shortened with flame and wick? A new pattern, closer to our own, began to emerge. The transformation was not only practical, but cultural. The Renaissance ideal of order, discipline, and control seeped into domestic life. Sleep, once a flexible rhythm attuned to nature's cycles, was increasingly treated as something to be harnessed, confined to fixed hours, so that the day could be filled with work and productivity. The loose wandering nights of medieval peasants, marked by communal talk and shared silence between the first and second sleeps, gave way to a more private, solitary slumber. The bed became a place not of broken wakefulness, but of long, uninterrupted rest. Slowly, the rich tapestry of medieval sleep practices began to be woven into something more familiar to us today. Still, fragments of the old ways lingered. In the countryside, Far from the clock towers and the crowded towns, peasants continued to sleep as their ancestors had. They still leaned upright against pillows, still rose at midnight to stoke the fire, or murmur prayers in the darkness, still shared communal beds where stories and secrets passed between the hours of rest. But these practices grew increasingly regarded as old-fashioned relics of a fading era. In the towns, a new expectation of straight, uninterrupted sleep spread, and with it the medieval world's unique relationship with the night began to recede into memory. The story of this transformation reveals much more than a simple change in posture or schedule. It reveals the way culture itself bends even the most natural human needs to its shape. Sleep, which might seem timeless and unchanging, was in fact a reflection of fears, beliefs, technologies, and ideals. The medieval habit of sitting up in bed was not merely a quirk, it was an answer to a world filled with uncertainty, a world in which the night was heavy with danger, and the body itself was a fragile vessel at risk of corruption. To lie flat was to court death, to sit upright was to remain vigilant even in slumber. But as the centuries passed and knowledge deepened, these fears loosened their grip. To lie flat was no longer to tempt fate, but to embrace a more natural repose. And so the long night of the medieval world gave way to the dawning light of modern sleep. The upright figure, propped against bolsters in a candlelit chamber, became a relic of woodcuts and old chronicles. In its place rose the horizontal sleeper, resting deeply through the night, lulled not by fear and watchfulness, but by the promise of uninterrupted hours. The journey from medieval sitting sleep to our own habits was not sudden but gradual, unfolding over centuries like the slow dimming of a torch as the morning sun rises. What remained, however, was the lesson that even something as intimate and constant as sleep is not fixed, but endlessly shaped by the world around it. As we look back upon these changes, there is a strange tenderness in imagining those long-ago nights, the shared warmth of bodies, huddled in a narrow bed, the flicker of fire casting gentle shadows on the beams, the soft rhythm of a first sleep interrupted by whispered prayers. These fragments of medieval nights remind us that the past was not only filled with hardship, but with moments of quiet connection. Though the upright posture and segmented rhythms may seem foreign to us now, they carried a logic and a beauty of their own. They were answers to the mysteries of the dark, ways of making the night less frightening and more human. By the close of the medieval age, those answers were slowly replaced by others. Light drove away the fear of darkness. Knowledge drove away the fear of lying flat. Clocks drove away the fluid rhythms of time. And sleep itself was reshaped, carrying humanity into a new era where the night was no longer divided but whole. The medieval sleeper sat upright. The modern sleeper lies down. Between them stretches a story of fear and safety, of tradition and change, of darkness and light. As the medieval world slowly drifted toward the dawn of the Renaissance, sleep, once viewed through the lens of spiritual symbolism, practical survival, and cultural tradition, began to transform into something closer to what we recognize today. The upright posture, the segmented nights, the prayers whispered in half-darkened rooms, all of these rituals carried the weight of centuries, but they did not vanish overnight. Rather, they blended, faded, and reappeared in altered forms as societies moved from feudalism to urban life, from dimly lit cottages to the glowing embers of new cities. It is in this slow evolution that we can trace the lasting legacy of why people once chose to sleep sitting up, and how that ancient practice has left subtle imprints on the way we imagine sleep, even now. The medieval mindset was never entirely separate from its religious core. To them, lying flat for extended hours was too close to the eternal rest of the grave. Sitting upright was a choice that balanced wakefulness with rest, a posture that said, I am still part of this world, not yet surrendered to the final silence. As the Renaissance began to unfold, with its emphasis on humanism and the rediscovery of classical texts, new attitudes toward the body and mind slowly emerged. Physicians, scholars, and philosophers re-examined the habits of rest. Yet the medieval customs lingered. The posture of half-repose had become ingrained, not only in practice but in memory, shaping how generations afterward would talk about the boundaries between sleeping and waking. By the 15th century, beds themselves began to change. No longer simple wooden frames covered with straw or wool, they became symbols of wealth, adorned with carved posts, heavy curtains, and layers of linens. The grandeur of a Renaissance bed suggested not just luxury, but privacy. Curtains kept out drafts, but they also created an enclosed world within the larger room. Yet for many people, even in such ornate spaces, the old customs persisted. Sitting up to pray before sleep, dozing in partial wakefulness, waking in the deep night for reflection or devotion, these rituals continued. They provided a kind of comfort, a bridge between the medieval rhythms and the new world slowly forming outside. The transition from segmented sleep to consolidated sleep was not abrupt. For centuries, people still woke in the middle of the night, whether to stoke the fire, check the household, or simply sit in silence. Some would use this time to read, if they were literate, or to write letters or poetry in the solitude of the early hours. This period between first sleep and second sleep held on to its mysterious liminal quality. Dreams were still considered meaningful, still tied to divine messages or glimpses of the unseen. Even as science began to question these interpretations, ordinary people clung to them, for they provided a sense of continuity in a world that was otherwise shifting with new discoveries, new maps, new horizons. The industrial age, much later, would finally impose stricter boundaries on the human schedule. The rise of factory work, timed bells, and mechanical clocks reshaped sleep into something that had to conform to production and labor. The upright posture, once a matter of safety, piety and symbolism, faded into memory. People began to lie down for long, uninterrupted periods, aided by advances in bedding, architecture, and lighting. Yet the remnants of the medieval tradition can still be glimpsed in certain habits. The idea of sitting up in bed, to pray, to read, or to reflect before surrendering fully to sleep, still echoes faintly of those ancient customs. The sense that midnight holds special meaning, a time of quiet thoughts and secret awakenings, is a remnant of segmented nights long past. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of the medieval practice of sleeping upright lies not in the posture itself, but in the philosophy it represented. For medieval people, sleep was not a void to be filled with unconscious hours. It was a sacred rhythm, a pause between work and devotion, a space for both body and soul to prepare for what came next. Their upright posture symbolized vigilance, humility, and readiness. Even in slumber, they did not fully abandon their duties to God, family, or community. To sleep was to remain partially aware, tethered to both earth and heaven, body and spirit. We in our modern lives often treat sleep as a necessity, something we chase, something we measure in hours, and track with devices. But in doing so, we may have lost some of the deeper mystery the medieval world preserved. To them, each night was a passage, each dream was a potential revelation, each posture carried meaning. Sitting upright was not only practical, it was symbolic. It reminded them of their mortality, and their devotion, their vulnerability, and their hope. In this way, their sleep was not separate from life, but an extension of it, woven seamlessly into their understanding of existence itself. Imagine then a medieval villager, closing the wooden shutters, stirring the embers, and arranging himself against the support of a bedframe or cushion. Outside, the world was dark, the village hushed except for the call of an owl, or the distant bark of a dog. Inside, the room was quiet but alive with presence, the breath of family members, the warmth of animals nearby, the faint glow of a dying fire. He prayed, sitting upright, whispering words he might not fully remember in the morning. His head drooped, rose again, and finally sank into the rhythm of sleep. Hours later, he stirred, not alarmed by his wakefulness but calm, expectant. This was the time to reflect, to be with God, to dream with awareness. And then when his eyes grew heavy again, he settled back into his second rest, knowing the cycle was as natural as the turning of the seasons. It is in these small, intimate moments that the truth of the practice comes alive. To sleep upright was not strange to them, it was familiar, comforting, and right. It spoke to their beliefs, their fears, their hopes, and their way of life. And though the centuries have passed, though our beds have grown softer, and our nights more artificially illuminated, There remains a quiet echo of their world in ours. When we wake in the middle of the night and wonder why, when we sit up in bed to gather our thoughts before lying down again, when we attach special meaning to dreams or to the stillness of midnight, we are in a sense reaching back across the ages, touching the memory of those who once lived and slept so differently. The story of medieval sleep, and of the upright posture in particular, is more than a curiosity of the past. It is a reminder of how humans shape even the most basic acts of life, with meaning, ritual, and imagination. Sleep is universal, yet its form has never been fixed. It bends to culture, to environment, to faith, to fear. In medieval Europe, it bent into a shape that balanced vigilance with rest, mortality with hope, silence with prayer. That shape has changed, but its shadow lingers. And perhaps, as we reflect on their ways, we can find not only fascination, but also a deeper appreciation for our own nights, our own dreams, our own mysterious journeys through the dark.